Today we're going to take a closer look at two types of instrument which appear in other programs in this series, though rather in the background. They're the keyboard instruments and the percussion. They include such rarities as the dulcimer, hurdy-gurdy and rommel pot, as well as better-known varieties like the organ and kettle drums. Of the keyboard instruments, the organ is much the oldest. As with so many aspects of arts and sciences, the Greeks did it all ages ago. About the year 250 BC, Ctesibios, a Greek engineer who lived in Alexandria, built an organ which became known as the hydraulis. Water organ is the usual but rather unfortunate translation, since it immediately conjures up a vision of plumbing and water gurgling through the pipes. In fact, the hydraulis simply used water as a means of pressure, as in the modern hydraulic engine. It was played by the Romans as well as the Greeks, and had no church associations whatsoever. It was regularly used to accompany gladiator fights and acrobatic shows. In Roman times and through the Dark Ages, there were bellows-operated organs as well as hydraulic ones. And when the organ was redeveloped after the Dark Ages in Europe, it was the bellows type which became standard. On a modern organ, even on a copy of an old one, the bellows are usually replaced by an electric blower, which saves someone a lot of effort. Right up to the end of the last century, church organs still had to be pumped by hand, and in medieval times, when the largest organs emitted a crude, powerful sound, well, a lot of air and a lot of elbow grease was required. This looks a rather unequal struggle. 6 men pumping air into a rather diminutive array of organ pipes, whilst the 2 monks seem to be more concerned with encouraging the bellows blowers to even greater efforts than actually doing any playing themselves. From a monk named Woolston, we have a description of the splendid organ built at Winchester in the 10th century. There were 400 pipes and 26 sets of bellows, requiring no less than 70 men to operate them. Woolston describes how the men were labouring with their arms, covered in perspiration, each man inciting his companions to blow up the wind with all his strength, so that the full-bosomed box may speak with its 400 pipes. Well, the result seems to have been an unholy row. Woolston describes how everyone covered their gaping ears with their hands, being in no wise able to draw near and bear the sound. Still, not all medieval organs required such a big labour force, nor were they quite so deafening. portative organ, or organetto, meaning little organ, was established by the 13th century. Whilst the big church organ was equipped with a rather unmanageable keyboard to start with, often consisting of a series of sliders rather than actual keys, the portative developed the neat arrangement of keys which are capable of rapid execution, which became the prototype for all the later keyboard instruments. Portatives seem to have been used for church music and are regularly depicted in the hands of angels, who, I may say, were not beneath pumping their own bellows. But they were certainly popular for secular music of all kinds as well. The first reed organ was the Regal, in which the reeds are contained in short wooden resonators, and the general effect is rather like a consort of crumhorns. This instrument is an original one, made by the German maker Hase in 1684, so not unnaturally it tends to sound a little querulous with age. Well, now let's have a look at some of the most common medieval percussion instruments. Many of them were imported from the Near and Middle East, and as late as the time of Mozart and Haydn, the sound of bass drums, cymbals and triangle was still referred to as the Turkish music. As with so many other instruments, it was really the Crusades which helped the spread to Europe. Along with the shawms and the long trumpets, the Saracen armies charged into battle to the sound of the large knackers or kettle drums. It was such a sound that Marco Polo describes hearing in 1266, when King Kaidu and the Great Khan waited for battle to commence. There were smaller sizes of knackers too, small enough to be strapped on round the waist. The knackers usually involved two sticks and was a good instrument for virtuoso improvisation. Much simpler was the tabor, basically a one-stick instrument useful for giving the basic beat for dance music. Then there were the timbrels, or tambourines, which, like the tabor, came in many different sizes, ranging from quite small to much larger ones, like this splendid instrument, still to be heard and seen in the streets of Cairo today. Early triangles are often depicted with a series of jangles hanging on the lower bar. This suggests they were sometimes shaken as well as struck, and that the triangle itself evolved from the rattle. All the shapes and sizes so far bear some recognizable resemblance to something that you might see or hear in the modern orchestral percussion section. But I think you'll agree there's nothing quite like the Rommel pot. The basically a friction drum. Any kind of container will do for a start, a pot or jug or something like that, but the really crucial feature is the stick inserted in the hole in the middle of the skin. There wasn't much in the way of tuned percussion during the Middle Ages, though by at least as early as the 16th century the xylophone was in use, and, as Hans Holbein shows in his Dance of Death, there was already an association with the macabre. But whilst the xylophone was admittedly a bit of a rarity, sets of tuned bells were widely used, both for teaching music and for accompanying plainsong in church. Their clarity and gentle resonance was ideally suited to medieval church music. We now come to the various types of keyboard instrument which employ strings. Two types became popular during the Renaissance, the clavichord and the virginals and harpsichord. Both are quite distinct from one another and from the modern piano. In fact, none of these instruments can be considered in any sense ancestors of the piano, although they do of course involve a keyboard and sets of strings. The earliest instrument to combine a simple keyboard with strings was the hurdy-gurdy, which had evolved at least as early as the 12th century. Now, this was a really ingenious attempt to mechanize the art of bowing. Instead of sounding the strings with a bow, there's a rotating wooden wheel turned by a handle. The wheel causes all the strings to sound simultaneously. And besides unstopped drone strings, there are melody strings too, stopped by a series of keys, which are rather like a series of mechanical fingers on a fingerboard. From occupying quite an elevated status in the Middle Ages, the hurdy-gurdy became more of a peasant instrument in later times. it may have looked as though we were cheating a bit there, but the hurdy-gurdy really did start out in life as an instrument for two to play. Now, there are a couple of features which link the hurdy-gurdy with the first of our new keyboard types, the clavichord. One is the way the keys press against the strings whilst a note is being played. And the other is the way a whole series of notes are obtained from the same string. Now, for the origins of both hurdy-gurdy and clavichord, we go back to Greek times once again. The experiments of Pythagoras led to the construction of an instrument called the monochord, on which the basic intervals of the scale could be demonstrated by either stopping the string or using a movable bridge. But gradually the monochord seems to have become a musical instrument in its own right, and by at least the year 1400 we have the clavichord, which developed from it. The action of the keyboard is relatively simple. You press down a key at one end and it raises a wedge at the other which touches the string. The wedge is called a tangent, and it acts like a movable bridge, stopping the string at a certain point but making it sound as well. The same string can be stopped at different points by different tangents, as long as it's to obtain notes which you're not likely to need to play simultaneously, of course, F and F sharp, for instance. Because of the clavichord's action, the sound is very soft, and it's also very expressive because of the nature of the contact between the player's fingers and the strings. Although later clavichords were built in larger sizes, the sound remained pretty soft. There is a resemblance to the piano because of the way different effects could be obtained just with the touch of the fingers. But the piano's mechanism, of course, relies on the action of hammers. The dulcimer is basically a psaltery struck with hammers. It remained in use up to the 18th century, and one of the early inventors of the piano claimed that the instrument had given him the idea for the piano's hammer mechanism. But the plucking action of the psaltery and the harp had already given rise to a quite different type of keyboard instrument over 2 centuries earlier. This is a copy of a harpsichord by one of the Rookers family, the famous Flemish makers who worked in Antwerp in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. As you can see, harpsichords have become quite a work of art, nice to look at as well as to listen to. And mechanically, they were quite involved. The basis of the plucking mechanism was a jack, which rises and plucks the string when you press the key down. The jack is really a kind of mechanical plectrum, equipped with a piece of leather or quill. Different materials produced different types of attack, and harpsichords used various sets of jacks and strings for contrast. Perhaps the most popular keyboard instrument during the 16th century was the virginals. As you can see from its oblong shape, the strings run parallel to the keyboard, not at right angles to it, and there's normally just the one basic sound. Here to finish with is a rather unusual piece from Elizabethan times, a duet for 2 keyboard instruments.